Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have Dr. Anthony Pinn joining us. How are you, Doctor?
I'm well. How about yourself?
I'm very well, thank you. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself?
Well, I live in Houston, Texas. I'm the Agnes, Cullen, Arnold Distinguished Professor of Humanities and a Professor of Religion at Rice University. I'm also the Director of Research for the Institute for Humanist Studies. It's a small think tank associated with the American Humanist Association in Washington, D.C. Much of my writing and lecturing and thinking over the past 3 decades has revolved around issues of humanism, and in particular, the relationship of people of African descent to humanism.
I'd like to jump straight into a number of questions. Some of these questions are questions that I have. Some of them are from various discussion groups that I'm a part of. Whilst analyzing the intersections of race and atheism, there seems to be a stigma attached to Black non-believers, as if due to the struggles of Black people, we should naturally continue to seek solace and justice through religion and the Bible. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first I'd say within the larger context, atheism is stigmatized. Whether one is Black, white, green, purple, it doesn't matter. Within the context of Britain, within the context of the United States, atheism is stigmatized, right? There is a general assumption that anyone who is an atheist is without a moral and ethical basis, right? The argument being that if you don't believe in God, if God is not holding you accountable, you'll do all kind of crazy stuff. Now, for people of African descent, it's amplified for a variety of reasons. One, it's amplified because there's an underlying assumption in both contexts that to be Black is to be religious. And more than that, there's an underlying assumption that to be Black is to be Christian. It's held inside Black communities and it's held outside Black communities. Within the context of larger communities, to be Black is to already be stigmatized, right? It's already to have a social strike against you. And if you are a Black woman, it's to have another strike. If you are not wealthy, yet another stigma. If your sexuality is not in line with the status quo, yet another stigma. So you have within the context of the larger social arrangement, multiple ways in which to be Black is to be stigmatized. And to add to that, atheism is yet another form of another way to be stigmatized. Within the context of Black communities, to be atheist is falsely understood as being guided by what white folks think, that Black people are not atheists, that the African context has no atheism, right? It's problematic, wrong-headed thinking, but it remains that within this context, it's assumed to be Black and to be an atheist means you are completely out of line with the workings and the assumptions of Black community. It is to be marginalized within the context of the marginalized.
When looking at the psychology of the indoctrination of theology, how is it that Black people embrace a theology that was forced on us and still look for salvation from this Christian belief system?
Well, it's complicated, right? So let's take the United States as a context. On one level, Christianity has been used to pacify Black people, right? To keep them in line. But you cannot explain Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner that way, right? That these were folks within the context of a slave system who said, no, this religion demands our freedom, right? So the situation is complex, that Christianity within Black communities has both served to encourage allegiance to the status quo, but it has also been used to urge against the status quo. Now, when asking the question, why do Black folks abide by a system that was used to oppress them, you also have to throw into that conversation the humanist or atheist tradition. Growing out of the Enlightenment, humanists and atheists also participated in the degrading of Black life. It wasn't just theists who did this, right? It was non-believers like David Hume who abided by this warped sense of Black life. So you don't free Black people from misunderstanding, from oppressive systems by simply saying, don't be a Christian, be an atheist. Take the United States, for example. I don't know very many humanists or free thinkers, you pick the category, who don't see in Thomas Jefferson something to celebrate. But as soon as humanists and atheists embrace Thomas Jefferson, they have also embraced sexual violence and anti-Black racism. So here's the question. How do we develop a system of thought, modes of practice that safeguard and enhance our well-being, and that do this in a way that ground us in the material nature of life? Right? How do we develop systems of thought and practice that respect and safeguard our embodied movement through the world, that form and encourage ways of being our best selves within the context of death-dealing circumstances? Seems to me that's the question.
Without even realizing the influence of theology as being deeply ingrained in our vocabulary, why is there such a taboo against people, and especially Black people, using the words such as atheist, agnostic, pagan, or humanist? And how do we change that?
The answer is in the question, right? That within both of our contexts, these are circumstances where the language of life is deeply connected with theistic sensibilities. Right? The United States was not founded, for example, as a Christian nation. That's just a lie. It was not founded as a Christian nation. But over the course of centuries, Christian perspectives of Christian grammar and vocabulary have come to be normalized. They guide public life. That's why conversation concerning humanism and atheism are considered problematic. They run contrary to the popular perceptions of what guides life in the United States and how one goes about describing life in the United States. They cut against theistic assumptions. This is why that atheistic or humanistic vocabulary is frowned upon. It challenges a theistic assumption as normative. How do we go about changing that? By using our language, right? You go about changing that by normalizing humanistic and atheistic sensibilities. You go about it by utilizing an alternate vocabulary and grammar, right? This is the way in which you strike against theistic vocabulary and grammar as normative. You do it by imposing a different way of speaking and thinking. Don't just shake your fist and argue with theists. Normalize non-theistic frameworks, a different vocabulary and grammar, normalize it, make it a part of how you communicate.
What are some of the poor patterns of thinking, communication, and practice supported by theistic religion?
I think one of the most harmful, if we think about people of African descent in both of these countries, one of the most harmful theological arguments revolves around this framework we call theodicy, or what can you say about God in light of human suffering in the world? It's a way of explaining and exploring human misery. And one of the most harmful theistic responses to human suffering revolves around redemptive suffering arguments. In short, these are theistic arguments that suggest there is something useful in our misery, there is something useful in our suffering, that God is going to change this. When I was growing up in the church, we phrased it this way: no cross, no crown. Right? The assumption that out of our misery, God brings about something great. What is the most graphic sign of this within Christianity? The Christ event, the crucifixion of Christ, which made the standard, the theological norm, good stuff coming out of misery. That has been most harmful to people of African descent because it has encouraged us not to fight against oppression, but to see something useful and redemptive in our oppression. Now, you cannot hold oppressors fully accountable if on one hand you are saying, I don't like what you're doing to us, but God's going to bring something good out of this. Where's the moral and ethical call to change behavior? It seems to me, again, these redemptive suffering arguments are the most detrimental theological thinking impacting people of African descent.
The struggle to leave a faith-based community is hard, as for some, everything they do revolves around the church in some form or another. And they equate the church as giving them purpose and meaning in life. Can you talk to us about having a soft place to land?
Ah, that's the language. I like that language, soft place to land. That is the problem that we have often assumed, and this is particularly the case with white-dominated organizations, that a critique of theism, a pointing out of its flaws, is sufficient. It is not. The Black church, for example, for all it gets wrong, it provides a community. It provides a place where Black folks don't have to explain why they're angry. It provides a space where Black folks don't have to worry about people coming and touching their hair. It provides a space in which folks can network, and on some level, despite all the problems with the theology, some level where they can catch their breath. Now, if we're interested in encouraging the growth of humanism and atheism, and if we think about generations of folks for whom theism is not the norm, right? Those who are unaffiliated, we have a growing population, and this growing population is also composed of people of African descent. If we want to encourage an explicit and public embrace of their humanist and atheist sensibilities, we have to give them a soft place to land. That is to say, we have to give them more than arguments against the church. Networks, social networks, right? Political, economic, social networks, a community, a place of the like-minded who share certain sensibilities, a space in which folks can work through the trauma of life, and also a space in which folks can celebrate when things go well. And here's part of the problem with humanism and atheism, that it often fails to provide a way to ritualize the good stuff in our lives. And ritual becomes a bad word when all it really means is repeated activity and founded space. If you go to a humanist conference every year and you go through the same motions and the same activities every year, that's a ritual. It's repeated activity and founded space, nothing necessarily supernatural about that. That's people giving a certain meaning to time and space and how they occupy both. Humanism and atheism cannot fully grow into communities composed of people of African descent until it provides a way to ritualize life, until it provides a way to communicate and deal with trauma, and a way to communicate and deal with the good moments in life, until it provides us, for example, a way to deal with loss in a family. Right? How do humanists and atheists help those who are non-theistic deal with the loss of a child? of a parent, of a sibling, right? How do we help folks celebrate those momental gains that they have in their lives? How do we provide folks with a way, again, to recognize change over time, to celebrate and mourn together? We've been too fixated on pointing out how churches are wrong that we've not given adequate attention to how we form an alternate community.
What are some of the biblical stories or biblical narrative that really bother you?
So here's my thing. I think the Bible is a piece of literature that has had tremendous impact. And I think humanists and atheists ought to read the Bible as literature, right? To get a sense of the moral and ethical frameworks that are informing and influencing life. So I'm not one who says, throw that thing away. I'm saying read it differently. Read it from the vantage point of the marginalized, right? Read it in a way that highlights suspicion and probing questions. I think one of the poor lessons within Scripture, one of the things that we ought to, as humanists and atheists, we ought to be providing an alternate mechanism, a different way of moving through the world. Think in terms of the story of doubting Thomas in the book of John, right? This is the dude who's one of the disciples. He's one of the few when it's getting close to that crucifixion, who says, look, let's travel with Jesus. And if we got to die with Jesus, we die with Jesus, right? That he is part of the 12. Now, according to the book of John, Jesus dies, resurrected. All of these folks just kind of flee, right? They can't deal with it. So Peter and these others flee. Jesus comes back and they see Jesus. Now it comes to Thomas and these disciples, the same ones who could not stand the heat and betrayed Jesus, are now telling him, look, we saw him. What does Thomas say? Look, I'm not going to believe you until I see and touch him. What's the positive lesson there that is in line with humanist sensibilities and a humanist outlook? Evidence. What does Thomas do? He celebrates evidence. Evidence that highlights and privileges the material nature of our lives. For him, it's not about faith out there. It's, I have to touch. What does Thomas do? That's in line with humanist and atheist sensibilities, demands evidence and physical material evidence. How can we be mad at that as humanists? Thomas says, show me the evidence. What do we say concerning any sort of claim? Show me the evidence. What I find detestable about the typical read of this is that they problematize Thomas and celebrate these others. When Thomas is giving us a way to value how we move through the world as embodied bodies, that we are material beings moving through a material world. And something about how we touch that world ought to inform what we say about that world. Thomas's hermeneutic is a hermeneutic we should appreciate. Again, show me the evidence.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Pinn.
Oh, my pleasure.